Hi friends, today we are going to discuss about inflation. Why why to discuss inflation first of all? So as you know, when I'm recording this video in November 2022, inflation or the rise in prices is hitting almost every country across the globe, starting from US to Europe to Asia. Literally, no country is spared with the havoc that inflation is causing at the moment. So let's discuss about it. What are the causes of inflation? What are the measures to control it as well? All right, let's go ahead. What is inflation? So inflation is a measure of the rate of rising prices of goods and services in an economy. Now, what happens when there is a rise in prices? So your money that you have is way less worth than what it was in the past. Reason being, with the same amount of money in your pocket, you will be able to purchase less number of goods and services, and hence the rise in prices of the same goods and services leads to inflation, which ultimately leads to a decrease in quality of your standard of living. So it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain the standard of living. Reason being, you will have less purchasing power now with the same money, but you will be able to purchase less number of goods and services, and it's reducing the value of money as well. Now, just is an example. Let's say your take-home pay in the US was $4,000 in 2012, and then in the 10-year period, with even a moderate rate or less rate of inflation, you still need $5,000 to maintain the same standard of living. So you'll be able to buy the same goods and services, everything remaining the same, only the prices that have changed. So you'll be able to maintain the same stuff with $5,000 and not $4,000 now. So this is the impact of inflation, which is there continuously and it's happening continuously. Now, some of the day-to-day examples when prices or where the prices rise are, for example, the food prices. You go to a grocery store and you see the price of an item, price of milk, for example, higher than what you purchased last week. Same way, the petrol prices keep on fluctuating, mostly rising these days, and it can be due to a number of factors. But ultimately, it results in your in having less money in your pocket to spend. Housing prices, for example, the housing market, real estate market, sometimes grow exponentially, and due to that, the prices rise, and you'll be able to you have to save more for more number of years in order to buy your dream house. So these are the day-to-day examples of inflation. Now we'll discuss about the measurement of inflation. So how is inflation measured? The main measure that we use is Consumer Price Index (CPI), which measures the percentage change in the price of a basket of goods and services consumed by households, and that's the most common goods and services basket that the government creates, and to which reflect the day-to-day spending of the people in that country, and that ultimately results into a measurement of the overall rise or fall in that basket of goods and services, thus leading to measurement of the inflation. You can also measure inflation on the production side, on the supply side as well, though it's not used widely, but it still gives you an indication on how the direction of inflation looks like. So that's Producer Price Index (PPI). It reports the price changes that affect domestic producers, and it measures, for example, prices of fuel, farm products, chemical products, metals, and so on. Now, how quickly the prices go up is a rate of inflation. So you hear in your day-to-day news and in the market that the inflation is hitting, say, 5%, 6%, 7%. So that's a rise in the price of the basket of goods and services over a period of time. So how quickly basically the prices rise or fall is essentially the rate of inflation or deflation. Now, a couple of important parameters that cause inflation. So there are three important parameters here. We'll discuss about that now. Causes of inflation. So first is demand pull. Now it's very simple. You can just understand it from the from the basics of economics. So when the total demand for goods and services, that is the aggregate demand, increases to exceed the supply of the same goods and services, or there's aggregate supply that can be sustainably produced. Once you have more demand in the market for any product or service, then obviously the prices rise. That's the basics of economics, as you know. So if you have 10 people trying to buy a particular, say, vegetable in the market, and there are only 3 sellers, there's not enough to produce available to sell for that particular product, then the supply, then the vendors will increase the prices, and the one who is able to pay more price will be able to buy that good. So that way the prices rise. That's a common logic of demand and supply. Now, why the demand would increase? So that's the question at the first place itself, right? So if there is a growth in the economy, employment is good, people have the employment, people are getting good salaries, there's economic expansion everywhere, then obviously the amount of money that the people will have in their pocket to spend will be more, and hence the demand for, so they will try to buy more goods and services, better quality goods and services, and hence the demand for those products and services will automatically rise, thus resulting into increase in prices of those products and resulting into inflation. So you can also consider it, for example, if the aggregate demand rises, then this is another cycle here. From the production side, when the demand rises, then obviously the companies or the organizations producing those goods and services will tend to produce more of that. So they will demand that there will be an increase in demand for the workers. And obviously with that demand, obviously the rise will happen for the wages of the workers, because if the company is requiring, for example, 10 workers all of a sudden to start working from the next day, and there are not enough people in the market, then they need to, the organizations need to increase the salary to attract the workers, and hence the rise in wages. And this will ultimately result into more aggregate demand, because now people will have more money in their pocket. So this cycle might continue till a point where it breaks down, and then the reversal happens. So obviously the economy always tries to balance itself. That's another point of discussion which we'll discuss in some other video. But understand this, that once you have more demand due to any reason, and those reasons might be related to the overall growth in the market or the overall positivity, increase in the money, the disposable income within the hands of people for due to low interest rates, or for whatever reason, ultimately this demand will cause rise in prices. Now, another cause of inflation is from the cost push side. So it's called cost push. When the increase in the cost of production leads to a decrease in the total supply of goods and services, the demand remaining the same, and this leads to an upward pressure on prices, and which is very obvious. So for any reason, if the cost of production rises, then understand that obviously the price of those goods and services will increase. And similarly, when the production cost rises, companies will have less money in their hand to produce those goods and services, and hence they'll produce less of that. So if the supply, they will have, so ultimately they will try to so as I was saying, when the total supply of goods and services reduces because of the increase in cost, while the demand remains the same, hence the demand exceeds the supply, thus ultimately leading to upward pressure on the prices. Now, why the cost of production would rise? That's the question here. It might rise due to many reasons. For example, the rise in the cost of raw material. It might also be because of the increase in wages. Some typical examples are, for example, the oil prices keep on fluctuating. So oil prices, if the oil prices rise, this results in the overall increase in the cost of production, because fuel is the most important element to run any industry, any factory. And it also results in the increase in the cost of the transport, thus reflecting into the price rise of the products and services. There might be also disruptions due to, for example, natural disasters. There's a flood happening that happens in a city, and this might be still a temporary thing, but it essentially results into rise in the prices. So that's the cost push side of the inflation. Now let's discuss third one, which is inflation expectation. So when the inflation consistently continues for a period of time, it's also called built-in inflation. Um, then people tend to expect the continued inflation in the future as well, um, which leads them to demand for higher wages, because they know that something which is costing, for example, $10 today might cost $12 in 6 months' time. So they will try to demand for higher wages. Then they will have, in that case, obviously, they will have more disposable income. It will also result into, obviously, once they have more disposable income, then the demand for those products and services will rise. It might also be due to the rise in production costs, and firms may increase prices due to anticipation of the inflation. So, because the companies know that the inflation would rise, inflation will be there for a period of time. They sometimes keep on just increasing their prices to reflect that. And there might be a rise actually in the production cost, which results them into increase in the price of production. But yeah, production cost is mostly related to the previous factor. Here it's more important that there's an expectation of the inflation being continued in the future, thus resulting into both sides of the workers demanding more wages, and similarly having more disposable income ultimately. And from the company's production side of the things, the companies tend to increase the prices in anticipation, and hence the price continue rising. Now, how do you control inflation? Because ultimately, more inflation will result in a degraded economy. Um, and the reason for that is very simple, because people will have less purchasing power, and thus this will result into less demand ultimately for the goods and services. So the companies would try to produce less and less, and this will result in the lowering of the growth. Now, there are two important levers that the country's regulatory bodies have to control inflation from their side. They can still control a huge part of inflation through these measures and levers, but there is something where if the overall employment and overall situation in the economy is not improving, then in that case, it's difficult to maintain the inflation rates. But in short, these are the two measures: fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is where the government adjusts its spending levels and tax rates to monitor and influence the nation's economy. So, for example, if the economy is having huge inflation, then the government might decide to spend less on the infrastructure. So they might take out less contracts for building roads, bridges, and so on, thus resulting into less amount of money supply in the market with the people, and thus resulting into less demand for goods and services, because people will have less money to spend, thus resulting into a lowering of the inflation over a period of time. Similarly, if you think the reverse way, if the inflation is in control but growth is not happening quite a lot, then the government might decide to spur growth. They might decide to increase the spending levels, and they might again float a lot of infrastructure related projects, or there are a couple of other ways that the government spends. Once the spending from the government increases, people will get more jobs, and there will be an increased demand in the raw material requirement and so on to complete those projects, thus resulting into a more disposable income in the hands of people, finally leading to a bit of inflation but high growth. Similarly, then there's a monetary policy through which the central regulatory bank of the country influences the country's money supply, and this is quite important. You might have seen there are regulatory meetings by the Federal Reserve of US, and similarly in India there's RBI, and there are Bank of England is there in UK, and so on. And the role of these central banks is or central regulatory bodies is mainly to control the money supply in the market through various measures. For example, CRR. There is a repo rate. There is overall interest rate, and it's called by different names in different countries. But ultimately, the goal from that body is mainly to reduce the if the inflation is high, then they will tend to reduce the money supply in the market by increasing the interest rates, because more interest rates will result into less dispersal of loans or less demand for loans, and money demand for the growth, thus resulting into less disposable income in the hands of people, and thus resulting in lowering of inflation. So monetary policy and fiscal policy work together. These are also sometimes called sister policies, and they work in tandem to control the inflation. Well, so there's a trade-off, as I said, between growth and inflation. High growth will result into high inflation as well, because when there's a growth in the market, when the economy is developing fast, then in that case, what happens is people have more jobs. Obviously, there'll be a demand for the raw material as well, which will result into more money in the hands of the people, and thus resulting into more demand and resulting into high inflation. Similarly, then if you control inflation by, say, tightening of money supply through the monetary policy or the tightening of fiscal policy, that will result in less demand for the raw material and so on, less production of which will result into less production of goods and services, because there will be less motivation to do that, and thus this will result into low growth of the economy. So these is a trade-off, and the government and the regulatory banks, they always try to keep a balance between the two, thus helping in the overall control of the inflation. Yeah, that's it, I think, for today, and we'll meet in next session. Thank you. Cheers. Bye.